The jungle sky cracked open with a flash of violet lightning as human soldiers scrambled for cover in the mud-soaked clearing below the ridgeline. Blaster fire echoed in bursts, flashing blue through the thick trees as enemy drones zipped overhead. Like hunting insects, Private Mason Halle ran, his boots slipping over roots and alien moss, lungs burning with each breath of the hot, chemical air. His squad had scattered, broken apart by the sudden ambush. And now he was alone, completely separated from the main unit. He ducked behind a thick tree, pressing his back against the bark as something hissed in the distance, like boiling acid on metal. This wasn't how his first combat drop was supposed to go. They said the native species on planet Varelia 4 were peaceful, too primitive for war, until they weren't. A few days ago, the aliens had started fighting back with strange weapons and armor that didn't match their tech level. Now, entire squads were disappearing, and recon drones were vanishing from the sky without a trace. Mason's radio was nothing but static now, and the night was closing in fast with sounds too sharp to belong to anything human. A sudden noise to his left made him turn, weapon raised. Breath held, branches shifted, and a shadow moved. No drone, no beast, something walking like a person, but too smooth, too graceful. He waited, finger on the trigger, until the figure stepped into the faint moonlight, breaking through the jungle. Canopy. She was tall, slender, skin a shimmering lavender, eyes large and silver with no pupils. Like twin moons, her armor was made of something flexible, organic-looking, like it grew on her body, and she raised her hands slowly in peace. Mason didn't fire. He couldn't explain why, but something about her didn't feel like a threat. In that moment, she looked at him with no fear, no anger, just something else. Something sad and quiet, like she was trying to remember something. She stepped forward and pointed toward the trees behind her, then made a motion like follow. Against all reason, Mason did, because standing still in this forest felt more dangerous than walking with an alien stranger. They walked for half an hour through a narrow trail covered in glowing moss and strange vines that moved slightly when touched. He didn't speak, and neither did she, but she looked back often to make sure he was still behind her. They crossed a broken bridge of stone and came to a hidden shelter built into a rock wall, covered in plants and natural camouflage. Inside, there was a soft, glow-green light coming from crystals embedded in the walls, and it was surprisingly warm and dry. She motioned for him to sit on the strange bedding, made of layered plant fibers, and Mason hesitated but obeyed. He should have asked questions, demanded answers, or at least tried to contact command again. But the moment he sat, exhaustion hit him like a wave. His muscles ached, and his eyes burned from lack of sleep. The alien girl knelt beside him without a word, her silver eyes studying his face like she was scanning his soul. Then she placed one hand gently on his chest, not with force, not with urgency, just simple contact, like checking his heartbeat. He tensed, confused and alert, but her touch was soft and strangely warm, and her voice finally broke the silence. "Feel me," she whispered, in perfect English, but her voice was more vibration than sound, echoing directly in his head. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a question. It was something else entirely, like a cry for help wrapped in comfort. Her hand didn't move, didn't press, just stayed there, like she was waiting for him to understand something deeper. He looked into her eyes, and they weren't just alien, they were filled with pain, like she had seen too many deaths, too many broken dreams. Mason felt something stir in him, not fear or attraction, but something heavier, like being trusted with a secret before you've earned it. His voice cracked when he finally spoke, barely louder than her whisper. "What do you mean?" he asked. But she didn't reply, only reached to take his other hand and placed it gently on her own chest. He felt a pulse, strong and steady, but the beat was different from a human's, slower, deeper, more like a drum than a rhythm. Her skin shimmered under his touch, glowing faintly where his fingers rested, as if reacting to the contact. The room was silent except for their breaths and the distant rumble of thunder outside the shelter. Mason wanted to pull away, to question what he was doing, but he didn't. Something passed between them, energy. Memory, maybe emotion itself, and it filled him with warmth and sadness all at once. He closed his eyes for a moment, and a flash of vision struck him, her world burning, her people falling, her alone in that forest waiting. She wasn't a soldier or a spy, she was a survivor, one who had been watching them long before they arrived, and she had chosen him. Not by accident, but with purpose, and now she had no words left, only touch to speak through. Mason woke slowly, his mind heavy like fog, his body warm despite the cold jungle night outside. He was still inside the shelter, but now he was lying down, a soft blanket of plant fiber over his body. The alien girl was sitting beside him, her legs crossed, her silver eyes watching him without blinking. She hadn't slept. Or if she had, she didn't need much rest like humans did. Her skin glowed faintly in the dim crystal light, and she looked like something out of a dream. He didn't understand yet. His memories came back slowly, the forest, the escape, her touch, that strange voice in his head. He didn't feel afraid. Not like before, and that confused him more than anything. Why wasn't he panicking? Why wasn't he running? Why did her presence feel more safe than his entire squad ever had? Mason sat up, blinking, and she leaned forward without hesitation, placing her hand on his shoulder. She didn't speak out loud, but once again her voice echoed inside his thoughts, gentle, clear, and sad. "You are not like the others," she said, her hand still resting on him like a bond being made. He stared at her, not sure what to say, not sure what she meant by others. Others? He asked out loud, his voice rough from sleep, his throat dry. She tilted her head slightly, then moved to a nearby stone bowl filled with glowing water and offered it to him. He drank it without question, surprised by the cool, sweet taste that eased his tension immediately. She watched every movement he made, like she was studying him, not in a cold way, but with strange affection. "I saw you fight," she said at last, this time with her real voice soft and musical, but clearly foreign. "You don't enjoy war," she continued, her words slow and careful, shaped with effort. Mason blinked, lowering the bowl, unsure how she knew that or why it mattered. "I was ordered to fight," he replied, more to himself than her, because he didn't know if he believed in the fight anymore. She rose slowly and walked toward the entrance of the shelter, pushing aside the hanging vines. A soft breeze carried the scent of wet earth and jungle flowers into the room. Beyond the trees, he could see strange shapes in the dark structures half swallowed by nature, ruins that looked ancient and alien. She gestured for him to follow again, and he did, this time without hesitation or fear. Outside, the ground was soft but firm, and they moved through the jungle with quiet steps like ghosts under moonlight. She led him to a tall tree with thick roots and pointed at the carved symbols, glowing faintly on its bark. "This is where I was born," she said, placing her palm on the tree, and Mason saw the lights grow brighter under her touch. It wasn't just a tree, it was alive in a deeper way, connected to her and maybe to all of her kind. She looked at him and said, "My people lived with peace, until humans came and broke it with fire and sky metal." Mason lowered his head, not in guilt, but because he couldn't deny her truth. He had seen what the first dropships had done. "But I don't hate you," she said next, her voice barely above the breeze. Mason looked up quickly, surprised, because he expected blame or anger, not forgiveness. "You're different," she said again. And this time she stepped closer than before, until their foreheads nearly touched. He could feel her breath, soft and warm, and her eyes held no fear, only trust. She placed his hand back on her chest like before, and he didn't resist. Warmth returned, and this time it spread deeper into his chest, his mind, even his spine. He felt more visions, faster now, memories that weren't his, feelings of loss, betrayal, exile, She had been cast out by her own people when she defended. A human scientist long ago, a man who died saving her. They had labeled her a traitor. And she had wandered alone for years in the shadows of the forest. And now she had chosen Mason, not because of orders or fate, but because he reminded her of the man who once showed her mercy. Suddenly, Mason felt like he was carrying her story. Too like it had been planted inside him with every touch. He stepped back, overwhelmed, but she held onto his wrist gently and said, "I don't want to be alone anymore." The words didn't sound romantic, not in the way he'd imagined, but they hit harder than anything else. He nodded once, unable to speak, because something deep in him was shifting, like gears unlocking. She smiled faintly, then turned back toward the shelter. And he followed with a strange calm in his chest. That night, as he lay on the plant fiber bedding, he couldn't sleep, not because of fear, not because of confusion, but because of what she had given him without asking anything in return. She sat silently beside him, watching the crystals flicker, her back against the wall. Then without a word, she climbed into the small space beside him, close but not invasive, simply present. Her hand rested gently on his chest again, and she whispered, only one word this time, stay. The morning light in the jungle wasn't golden like Earth's, but pale green, filtered through thick leaves and strange air. Bird-like creatures with 6 wings called through the canopy, but Mason barely heard them as he woke to the gentle pressure of a hand still on his chest. The alien girl was still beside him, eyes closed, her breathing slow and steady, her form relaxed and trusting. He didn't move right away, afraid to break the peace, afraid to wake something that felt too fragile to exist outside that moment. But eventually she stirred, lifting her head slightly, and their eyes met without a single word needing to be spoken. She sat up and stretched with slow grace, the soft glow returning to her skin where sunlight touched her shoulders. He rose too, rubbing the back of his neck, unsure what he was supposed to say or do after a night like that. There was no map for this, no orders, no training for connecting with someone who wasn't even human. But his heart didn't feel confused. It felt clearer than it had in weeks, maybe longer. When she stood and offered her hand this time, he didn't hesitate to take it. They walked further into the jungle, away from the ruins, along a path lined with luminous plants and hanging vines that pulsed faintly. He could tell now this place wasn't wild. It had been shaped, nurtured, cared for by her people long ago. She brought him to a circular pool filled with soft blue light, and she knelt beside it, dipping her fingers in. Images rippled across the surface, her memories shone again through water instead of touch. He saw her childhood, her training, her exile, and the moment she found him in the forest. "You weren't supposed to survive the crash," she said, finally breaking the silence. Mason frowned, heart tightening as the memory of fire and metal flashed in his mind. The ambush, the fall from the ridge. "I hit hard," he murmured, realizing he'd blacked out much more than he thought. She nodded slowly, eyes distant. "I pulled you from the wreck before your enemies found you," she said. He sat beside her, watching the images fade from the water as the surface stilled again. "You saved me," he said, voice low but firm, more statement than question. "I did," she replied, with no pride or drama in her tone, just truth. "But why?" he asked, and this time her answer came slower, heavier, as if she had waited long to say it. "Because I wanted to know if one of you could still choose peace, even when surrounded by war." Mason looked away, ashamed of how easily he had pulled the trigger in the past, how many targets he had hit without asking why. "I didn't come here to destroy," he said quietly, not sure if he meant it as an excuse or confession. She touched his arm, not to comfort, but to steady him, to remind him she had already seen him. "You still have a choice," she said, standing slowly, her voice soft but unshaken. "But the window is closing." They returned to the shelter, and this time she opened a small stone case hidden in the wall. Inside was a round device that pulsed with soft Purple energy, something ancient and powerful. Mason recognized some of the markings. It was tech far beyond human understanding. Something recovered from deep ruins. This is a memory core, she explained, lifting it with both hands like it was a living heart. It holds the knowledge of my people, their laws, their history, their last warning to the stars. He watched her cradle it with care, her fingers trembling slightly, and he understood its weight wasn't just physical. If the humans get this, what happens? He asked. They will break it, she replied flatly. Not because they are cruel, but because they will try to use it without understanding it. And that will awaken something that should never wake again. Mason's chest tightened. He wasn't a leader, not even an officer, but now he held the burden of a decision that could affect entire worlds. I'm not special, he said, shaking his head slowly. Her silver eyes looked into his like she was measuring something far deeper than rank or blood. But you listened, she said simply, and that makes you different from the others. He didn't argue. He couldn't. Not when every part of him felt the truth behind her words. The girl stepped closer, placing the memory core in his hands and wrapping his fingers around it gently. It has chosen you too, she said, and it will respond only to your will from now on. The crystal pulsed softly in his palm, warm and alive, and he felt his vision blur again, but this time, it wasn't memory. It was a message, a warning, a map of what was to come if they failed to protect it. When he came back to himself, she was standing at the doorway, her back turned to him, speaking into the wind. If you stay, they'll come for you, she said. If you run, they'll hunt both of us. But if we face them together, they'll have to hear us. Asterisk. Mason stood at the edge of the shelter, staring out into the jungle as the alien girl's words echoed in his mind. He held the memory core tightly, its steady pulse in his hand like a second heartbeat, guiding him toward something larger than himself. The breeze carried the scent of burning leaves, distant but growing stronger. And it meant only one thing: his people were coming. They would not stop to ask questions, not with orders to secure or destroy anything alien in their path. And if they found her, they wouldn't see a protector or a guide. They'd see only a threat. She stood beside him now, tall and quiet, her silver eyes scanning the treetops like she could already feel the warships drawing near. They will arrive by nightfall, she said calmly, her voice steady though her fingers curled into her palm. Mason turned to her, jaw tight, mind spinning as the weight of the memory core grew heavier. There has to be another way, he muttered, not sure who he was trying to convince. But she shook her head slowly and replied, there is only truth or silence, and silence has killed too many. They began packing what little supplies they had: dried roots, clean water, and a small blade that shimmered like crystal. The alien girl wrapped the memory core in a cloth, woven from light fibers, folding it with care like it was sacred. She wore no armor, only the soft organic cloth that moved with her body like a second skin. Mason checked his sidearm, unsure if it would protect them or make him a target when the others saw him walking beside her. Still, he holstered it and followed her through the jungle. Deeper into the heart of the forest, they reached a ridge that overlooked the human forward base tents, landing pads, signal towers rising above the broken trees. From this high point, he saw ships arriving, their engines glowing red against the sky, bringing reinforcements and more destruction. She crouched beside him, silent as a shadow, and pointed toward a communication dish mounted on a rocky ledge. If you can connect the core to that system, your people will hear the truth, if they are willing to listen, she said. Mason didn't answer right away, watching the patrols move like insects far below, unaware they were being watched. It was a suicide mission. If they were caught, he'd be shot for treason, and she'd be executed on sight. But something inside him had changed since the moment she touched his chest and whispered, "Feel me." He had felt her people's pain, their lost hopes, their final cries before they vanished beneath fire and steel. And now he had the only thing that could stop the next war before it began, not a weapon, but a story. A truth sealed inside a glowing crystal, handed to him by someone who had every reason to hate him but didn't. They moved at dusk, when the shadows grew longer and the noise of the base became louder. Using fallen trees and dry trenches, they crept down the slope, avoiding patrols and security drones. Mason moved like a ghost, her steps just behind him, not making a sound. Her senses sharp and alert. They reached the outer fence, where energy barriers flickered low from the recent storms, just enough for a breach. He cut a small opening, and they slipped inside, crouching low as they moved toward the broadcast relay. Alarms had not yet sounded, but it wouldn't stay quiet. For long, they reached the base of the tower, and Mason climbed the ladder fast, the memory core strapped to his chest. She remained below, watching the path, her eyes glowing softly in the dark like a silent guardian. At the top, Mason found the access panel and ripped it open, hands shaking as sparks flew out. He placed the core inside and pressed the final seal, watching as the interface lit up, and began translating. A voice filled the base speakers, hers. Not speaking now, but remembering. A story from the heart of another world. It spoke of peace and betrayal, of broken promises and hidden truths, of a species asking not for war, but understanding. Soldiers below stopped in confusion, weapons lowered, unsure if this was an attack or something else entirely. Command scrambled to shut the signal down, but the message had already reached every screen, every earpiece. Mason climbed down fast as floodlights turned, and the base roared to life with voices and warnings. She grabbed his hand the moment his boots hit the ground, pulling him into a side path away from the approaching guards. They ran into the trees, heart pounding, boots hitting soft earth, surrounded by blinding light and shouting behind them. But they didn't stop, not until they were far enough that only the forest could hear them again. She dropped to one knee, gasping for air, and Mason knelt beside her, their hands still linked. And then she looked at him, not with fear, not with regret, but with a soft, tired smile. "You did it," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time since they met. The memory core had been heard, and even if war still came, it would not begin in silence. Mason nodded, but he knew it wasn't over, not yet, not with the entire base now hunting them. She stood slowly, wiping dirt from her face, and looked up toward the distant hills. "We have one place left to go," she said, her voice growing steady again. "The final chamber where the first truth was buried." The jungle changed as they moved higher into the mountains, leaves darker, air colder, and the trees whispering with sounds that weren't wind. Mason kept close behind her, each step heavier than the last, not from exhaustion but from the truth he now carried in his chest. He had sent the message, shared her people's story, and broken every law his uniform stood for. But it still didn't feel wrong. It felt like waking up from a long dream where everything had been about orders and survival. And now it was finally about meaning. The alien girl walked without fear, even as shadows stretched long around them and distant thunder rolled above the peaks. "This path hasn't been walked in many years," she said, her hand brushing moss-covered stone carved with strange glowing lines. "This was where our world first opened its heart to the stars, and where it closed it again." Mason didn't speak, letting her guide the silence, knowing some moments required stillness instead of words. Each step brought them closer to something ancient, and he could feel it now, the pulse beneath the earth like a buried heartbeat. When they reached the cliffside, she stopped and placed her palm on a curved wall of stone. A doorway opened with a soft hum, light trailing from her fingers like a signal being answered. Inside was a chamber carved into the mountain, its walls filled with glowing markings that moved like water across crystal. The air was heavy, not with danger, but with memory. It smelled of dust, life, and something older than time itself. In the center stood a raised platform, and on it rested a tall, Broken monument shaped like a tree made of light. She stepped forward slowly, placing both hands on the base of the monument, and the entire chamber came alive. Visions bloomed across the walls, images of her people long before humans came. When they lived among the stars freely, Mason saw cities that floated, creatures of light, and beings who spoke through emotion instead of sound. But then the images changed, ships falling, fire spreading, strangers arriving not to speak, but to conquer. Her voice broke the vision, quiet but sharp. Your kind did not start the war, but they never stopped it either. Mason felt the sting of her words, not as blame, but as a reminder that silence and obedience could still destroy. She turned to him and said, "The monument needs one more connection before it activates fully." He looked confused until she stepped closer and reached for his hand, placing it gently against the glowing crystal. It must recognize a soul willing to carry both blood and truth, she said, voice shaking slightly. Mason hesitated for only a breath, then pressed his palm firmly against the monument's light. It flared instantly, heat rushing through his body, and for a moment he couldn't see or breathe. Then it all returned: visions, voices, memories not his, flooding his senses with pain, joy, love, loss. He saw the day her people fled underground, carrying this monument as their last hope of return. He saw the betrayal from within their own ranks, those who made deals with invaders to survive, and he saw her much younger fighting her own elders to protect something she barely understood. Now she stood beside him again, eyes wide, her hand still holding his tightly as the monument pulsed. The chamber sent out a beam of light through the mountain top, shooting into the sky like a flare for the stars. Every sensor in orbit would detect it. Every ship, human or otherwise, would now see what had been hidden for centuries. The truth was no longer silent. It had risen from the ground and reached into the black above. She looked up and whispered, "Now they'll have to listen, no matter how much they try to deny." Mason lowered his hand, breath short, but his heart steady as the light faded from the crystal. Footsteps echoed outside, fast, hard and many. He turned sharply, gun drawn. As human voices shouted down the ridge and boots stomped closer, she stepped in front of them calmly, lifting her hands without fear, and her voice called out in the language of the stars. The soldiers poured into the chamber entrance, rifles aimed, helmets gleaming, confused by the light and energy around them. "Stand down!" one shouted, but his voice trembled when he saw Mason standing beside her, unarmed and alive. A man in officer colors stepped forward, Captain Brenner, Mason's former commander, eyes sharp with suspicion. "What have you done, soldier?" he demanded, gun half raised, the tension thick enough to break bones. Mason stepped forward, slowly, hands open, and said, "I did what you couldn't, I listened." The captain stared at him, then glanced at the alien girl who stood tall and unflinching beside the glowing monument. The chamber hummed louder now, almost like it was breathing with them, waiting for the next choice to be made. "This is bigger than all of us," Mason said quietly, stepping beside her again, his voice steady. "You can either shoot or hear what the galaxy has been trying to say for 100 years. Brenner hesitated, finger twitching on the trigger, but he didn't fire, not yet, not as the light surrounded them. And in that breath of silence, the alien girl reached up and gently touched Mason's hand. "I knew you'd bring them here, not to destroy, but to begin again." The silence after her words was heavier than the air inside the ancient chamber. Captain Brenner stood frozen, his eyes locked on the monument still pulsing with faint light behind them. The other soldiers shifted uneasily, fingers near triggers, their helmets hiding fear they didn't know how to explain. No one moved as the alien girl stepped forward slowly, her hands still raised in peace, her voice low and clear. "You fear me because I am not like you, but I feared you first, and still chose to save one of yours." Her voice echoed not only through the room, but through every communicator now sensed with the signal from the monument. Around the planet, every base, every ship, Every officer now heard her words just as Mason had the night she first touched him. "I am not your enemy," she said, and her silver eyes glowed softly as they met each soldier's stare. "I carry no weapon, but I carry truth. And this truth remembers everything your history forgot." No one fired. No one spoke, because the light in the room made every weapon feel small and meaningless. Mason stepped beside her, lowering his sidearm fully, and turned to face his former. "Commander, she saved me when your orders would have left me to die," he said, his voice firm and steady. "She carried me from the wreck, healed me, fed me, and shared her people's pain with me, not to control, but to teach." He held up the memory core again, its glow steady and warm, no longer hidden, no longer feared. "This isn't a threat, it's a bridge. If we're brave enough to walk it." Brenner's expression didn't change, but his weapon lowered slightly as if part of him started to listen. Behind him, one soldier deactivated her rifle, and another took a quiet step back, unsure but no longer pointing a gun. "I didn't come here for diplomacy, Halle," Brenner said at last, but his voice had lost its edge. "No, sir," Mason replied, meeting his eyes calmly. "You came here for victory and found something better. She gave us a second chance, now we decide what to do with it." Outside, the sky changed. From above, human ships and satellites began receiving the full transmission. The shared knowledge of a forgotten people. The monument's beacon spread its light through every human frequency, unlocking archives, showing images and voices long buried. Commanders across space paused their battles, watching with confusion and awe as truth spilled into every system they controlled. The war paused not because of orders, but because hearts everywhere were suddenly filled with questions louder than gunfire. In the chamber, Captain Brenner slowly lowered his weapon to the ground. He looked at the alien girl, at Mason, then at the glowing monument that now connected two species through shared memory. "I don't understand all of this," he said quietly, "but maybe that's the point. We don't need more understanding right now." Mason answered, "We need courage to start from zero and listen." The captain gave a single nod, and the tension in the room finally broke like steam escaping the sealed chamber. The soldiers stepped back, lowering their rifles one by one, and the alien girl exhaled a long, tired breath. Her hand found Mason's again, and for the first time since they met, her shoulders relaxed. "We opened the door," she whispered, voice trembling as if a weight had finally lifted. "Now let's make sure it stays open." Mason replied, his grip tightening just enough to let her know he meant it. They left the chamber together, stepping into daylight not as fugitives, but as messengers of a different future. In the days that followed, her people began to emerge from hiding, guided by the monument's signal and her voice. Human researchers arrived not with cages or weapons, but scanners and translators and open hands. Treaties were signed not in glass towers, but beneath ancient trees where her ancestors once sang to the stars. Mason stayed beside her through it all, not as her protector, not as her soldier, but as her chosen equal. The jungle that once whispered of war now sang again, but this time it sang of peace. He rebuilt his bunk beside her home, beneath the same shelter she once guided him to in silence. Nights were no longer filled with alarms or fear, but with soft voices, shared meals, and the warmth of closeness. Sometimes she would still place her hand on his chest when words were not enough, and he would place his on hers. They didn't need to speak all the time now. Their hearts had learned each other's rhythm, and in that quiet rhythm, something stronger than war was born. One evening, as the stars lit the sky and the monument's soft glow hummed in the distance, she curled beside him in the bunk. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it reached him all the same. "You felt me, and you never let go." Mason closed his eyes and held her hand against his chest, smiling faintly. "I never will."